Well, good evening, Soundside Church. Pastor Aaron coming to you one more time here in the book of Ruth for our community groups. In fact, tonight is the last night that we were going to be taking in the book of Ruth, and we're going to be kind of taking a bit of a break for the summer. We'll come back to our community groups in the fall, and I hope that you'll make plans to join us for that. I hope that the book of Ruth has been an encouragement and a challenge to you. And tonight, I just want to act one more time as your guide and maybe point out something that you read, give it a little bit more information, and hopefully give you some more appreciation, not only for the book of Ruth, but for Ruth the person and what a wonderful character she was. Well, tonight you read Ruth chapter 4, verses 1 through 17, and you read about something that we call levirate marriage. Or maybe we don't call it that. Perhaps you've never used the phrase levirate marriage. Well, it is something found in our Bibles. Has nothing to do with the tribe of Levi or the book of Leviticus. Instead, levirate is actually a Latin word, and it means husband's brother. And it refers to a practice that we find in our Bibles, as well as many ancient cultures, in which if a man and a woman were married, and the man died, and they did not have a son, then the widow would marry the dead man's brother in order to attempt to have a son, and then the son, the firstborn son, would inherit everything that belonged to the dead husband. Did that make sense? I hope it did. Well, you read something kind of like that in Ruth chapter 4. I say kind of like it because there's a few little differences, but here we go. This is Ruth chapter 4, verse 10. Boaz is explaining what he's doing to the elders of Bethlehem, and he says, "Also, Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought her to be my wife to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers." It's a very interesting phrase. I am marrying Ruth to raise up offspring so that the name of the dead will carry on in his inheritance. Such an interesting phrase. Earlier, we read that when Boaz had offered the property to the relative that was closer to Elimelech, the guy declined it. When Boaz said, "Oh yeah, if you buy the property, you got to marry Ruth." And the guy said, whoa, I can't imperil my own inheritance. And the idea, I think, is that he would have spent a lot of money to buy this property, and all of it would have gone to the firstborn son that he and Ruth would have had, and he and his own family wouldn't have been able to get any return on his investment. That's kind of the feeling that I get from that. Well, regardless, when he declined it and Boaz kind of stepped in, he took his sandal off. Kind of an interesting custom. But both these ideas we can find all the way back in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 through 10, where we find the law of the levirate marriage. Now there, it's described as two brothers. And we certainly know that Boaz was not the brother of Elimelech, and certainly not the brother of Mahlon and Chilion. He was, however, a relative. And so it seems like the principle of the levirate marriage was being extended, or Ruth, in her ingenuity, was using the principle of the levirate marriage to attach it to the property so that she could make sure that Naomi was provided for. Regardless, in Deuteronomy chapter 25, even though the conditions are a little bit different, we find the same sort of language. The idea being that the brother of the dead man has a duty to marry the widow and to have a son so that the name of the dead is not blotted out from amongst Israel. That's the idea, and that's the explicit purpose of levirate marriage. We could say there's financial purposes, but the explicit purpose was to perpetuate the name of the dead. And if for some reason the guy didn't want to perform his duty in doing that, he had to take his sandal off. And he became known as the guy without a sandal. That was a title of shame. Now you say, well, now why would somebody not want to do that? In today's romantic culture, we can think of a million reasons. Maybe he didn't like her, maybe, whatever. But in those days, there was actually a really, really good reason not to do the duty of the brother-in-law. And that was because if there was no son to inherit the land of the dead husband, well, guess what? There was more land to go around. more land for everybody else to grab up. And if the land was grabbed up and was allotted to different family units, guess what happened? The name of the dead was disconnected from the land. There was no one to carry that name on, and the name ended. That family line ended, and it was as if that person had never existed. Now that may seem a little weird to us today. Today, we think of names as labels that get stuck on things, okay? In ancient culture, and especially in Bible times, a person's name was almost synonymous with who they were as a person. In fact, you could say that the way a person appeared was merely an embodiment of their name. Okay, we put names as labels onto things. They tried to live up to their name or gave names according to the character of the person. Needless to say, a person's name was way more important than it is to us today. But there's an even deeper reason why this was so important. We could say that the whole idea had a financial concern, that is, keep the inheritance in the family, make sure the widow's provided for, but it goes much deeper than that. I'm going to try to simplify this for the next just couple of minutes, but it goes all the way back to Abraham. The Bible tells us the story of humanity's ruin and depravity and sin and condemnation and corruption. But it also tells us the story of God's grace in that he selected a man by the name of Abraham to become the father of a nation through whom he would spread his blessings to the world, that blessing being salvation from sin. Now, God had a lot of dealings with Abraham, but the first thing we read in Genesis 12, verse 2, God says to Abraham, "And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing." Now, we don't have time to do this tonight, but for the next few chapters, God enlarges on that promise so that Abraham's offspring basically become him. Like, his name being great is great in his offspring being great. And we come all the way back to Genesis chapter 22, where God says this to Abraham in verse 18, "In your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed." In other words, the covenant made with Abraham of salvation and redemption was a covenant that passed through him into his offspring, so that his offspring became the means by which God's salvation would reach to the ends of the earth. And every single Israelite, I'm simplifying this, every single Israelite received that promise and was responsible for passing that promise on unto the next generation. So that if a person was fatherless or a person was childless, it was more than just a personal tragedy. It was almost seen as a spiritual accusation that this person was cut off from God's covenant of redemption. It was that serious. Now, we don't get a lot in the Old Testament about the afterlife. That whole idea gets developed throughout the scripture as we learn more and more and more. And finally, Jesus really kind of fills us in on all of that. But in the Old Testament, a person's name connected to the land was so intrinsically bound up with God's covenant of redemption that a person's name was almost synonymous with immortality. It really was that serious. And so the idea of perpetuating the name of the dead in his inheritance was almost at the level of taking responsibility to make sure that God's plan of redemption moved forward. Nobody's personal spiritual salvation was bound up with whether or not they had kids. However, that was linked to God's plan of redemption in the understanding of God's people in the Old Testament. When Jesus comes, he takes that idea and he actually transforms it and enlarges it. No longer are we worried about the physical land of Israel. Now we're worried about the entire earth and all the nations. But as far as our name is concerned, Jesus says this in Revelation chapter 3 and verse 5. Jesus considers those who walk before him faithfully, and he says this. He says, to the one who overcomes, to the one who conquers, I will never blot his name out of the book of life. I will confess his name before my Father and before his angels. Our names are not bound up with what our descendants do. Our names are bound up with what Jesus did. And it's more than just having your name on a roster in heaven. If your name is written in the Lamb's Book of Life, it is you who are present with God. It is you whom Jesus will stand with before his Father and before the angels. My question to you is this: is your name written in his book? Ruth becomes an embodiment of that Redeemer to make sure that Naomi receives the blessings of the covenant of redemption. Jesus fulfilled it for all of us and offers it to us freely through faith in him. I'm going to turn this over to your community group leader now.